Thank you. Well, to begin with, the title, From Menstruation to Triathlons, we may be asking, what does menstruation and what do triathlons have to do with mathematics? Well, that's basically the point of what we're looking at today. I teach a course at Tacoma Community College. It's Math ampersand 107. The ampersand is the symbol that says it's a common course numbered system, meaning that every community college in Washington State has a Math 107, Math in Society. How it gets taught varies considerably. In particular, there's the description for our campus: mathematical theory combined with quantitative skills and a few other things, and you get to use a thematic approach if you want. I helped to develop that so that I could use that as a vehicle to teach ethnomathematics. So the theme that I'm talking about is teaching ethnomathematics. But we have to figure out, what does that mean? So let's take the word ethnomathematics apart. First is the term ethnos, which means cultural, within a cultural environment. Second part is mathema. A way to look at that is explaining and understanding in order to transcend, managing and coping with reality in order to survive and thrive. In short, living as human beings, doing the things we have to do to be alive, have fun, and enjoy what we're doing. And then techniques. Well, what are the techniques that make it mathematics? Counting, ordering, sorting, measuring, weighing, ciphering, classifying, ordering, inferring, and modeling. So ethnomathematics is about what do we do as humans that requires us to do these techniques. But when we do them, they are always in a culture. No matter where we are living, we are working, we are playing in some culture. So ethnomathematics is about that. In particular, the way I phrase it, this theme of ethnomathematics is about an investigation of the use and development of quantitative reasoning, so basically a quantitative reasoning course, within various cultural contexts, arising in response to problems, struggles and endeavors of human survival and development. The important part there is, where does math come from? It's not given to us on tablets. It's developed by human beings. Mathematics is a human development, and how it comes about is when we have problems. One of the ideas I often have my students work with is, well, ask, what's a problem in your life? When I was teaching this sort of course in northern New York, somebody said, my car didn't start. Well, that's a problem. So what do? How do I solve it? Well, you come up with a way to solve it. And some of that way to solve that for you that very particular day involves the the counting and measuring and so on. One way, well, I can call a tow truck to come and get me. But then I have to make sure I have money to cover the tow truck. So I've got to do some technique thinking through that. But then I said, well, what happens if you lived here in that spot 200 years ago? Would that have been a problem? And the answer is no, we didn't have cars. And if I was living in the middle of Manhattan, would that be a problem? And the answer is no. So it is very much a problem that's culturally bound. It's important that it comes from within the culture you are in. So a culture has problems that are common to people. How many of you have had problems with car not starting, for example? Okay, there you go. And each one of you solved it somehow. You got through that day. But as a culture, when we solve them, we come up with common ways to do them. In the city of Portland, what would be a way to get around that? That's common, everybody could access. Transportation, public transportation. So the culture has a way to solve that. So every culture has problems that are unique to that culture. The individual solver becomes cultural approaches. That's how mathematics comes about. Some cultures, and in particular Western culture has been very good at this, take the techniques and say, well, what can I extract from that? Can I extract some theory from that? Some cultures don't do that. Some cultures don't bother. Some cultures do. But that's basically what ethnomathematics is about. Now, why I'm doing that for this course in particular, this Math in Society. For most of the students, this is the last mathematics course that they'll ever take. They're in the course because they want an associate's degree, and to get an associate's degree, you have to have a 100 level math course. And they really don't care what it is as long as they can get through it. It's my last chance to talk to them, to get them to become mathematically literate and confident. That's the important part, confident citizens of their world. I want them to see mathematics as more than just the variables, numbers, formulas, equations. Basically, many of my students that I have just come through algebra. To get to that course, they've had to take 2 or 3 quarters of algebra. And they see mathematics as factoring. And that's about it. And they tell me, when I teach that course, they ask me, why do I do this? What good is it ever? They see that is mathematics. What they don't see is what they do in their lives as mathematics. I had a student a number of years ago who was having difficulty with her math course. This was at a 4-year school. She came in to talk to me and asked me, said, I'm not good at math. I can't do math. And I said, well, what do you do with your life? She said, well, among other things, I design costumes for the theater department. So I said, okay, you mean you take 2-dimensional material and you turn it into 3-dimensional objects? That's topology. And you tell me you don't do mathematics. Well, I've tried to get, part of this course is to get students to say, look in their lives and see the things that they do and see that they do mathematics. And to do it by having them look at other cultures in particular. Consequently, the important part is, I don't organize this course around mathematical content. I organize it around mathema, things that human people do. And here's the list of those things. The first is that counting is a universal activity. Humans everywhere count. Even in the few cultures that have only 1 or 2 or 3 words for counting, they still count in some way. So we spend some time talking about how do people count and how would they go about it. Doing art and craft, particularly craft, making quilts, doing column, the threshold drawings. This image on the side here is an expansion of a drawing that's done by women in India on the thresholds. Kinship structure. How do we organize? How do we organize? There's a beautiful example of Australian kinship structure that gets turned, that Western mathematicians go bonkers over because it fits perfectly into a graduate level abstract course. They don't think of it that way. They just organize things. Games people play, of course, everybody loves to play games, and think about every game we play has in it some level of mathematics. The one I'm including, relatively new to this idea, is divination. How do we go about what I call consulting the divine? How do we do that? Is there logic in that? In fact, part of what I will talk today is about how that's structured, how the logic is there. And a little bit about everyday American cultures, and that's where the triathlon comes in. One of my hobbies is being a triathlete, and I have play with numbers all the time in my hobby, so I bring that into it. So those are the ways I organize it. What I want students to get is to discover the ways in which math is developed by everybody. It's developed by everybody in all cultures in response to their problems. In particular, it's important to remember it isn't just solving their problems, but doing things like art, doing things like spirituality. The whole realm of human experience involves doing things that require mathematical thinking. The other thing I want students to see is to have them recognize and appreciate the ways in which they themselves already use quantitative reasoning skills in their lives. They don't get that when they're in an algebra course. They see that as totally foreign and outside of themselves and their own world. I want them, by the end of this course, to realize they've gone through all that algebra, yes, but they do a lot of stuff otherwise, and to get them to see that, so that when they're out of this and they're walking into the voting booth, or they're negotiating to buy a home, or anything that involves any amount, or even trying to get to work on time in a rush hour traffic, where they have to learn to think, and to get them to use quantitative skills. And I want them to see that ethnomathematics in their own cultures. I asked a number of my students to give me a few responses. I emailed a couple of classes, and in typical fashion, most of them never even checked their email. But I did get 3 good responses. And these are the things that they say they got out of this course. I really enjoyed learning the culture of math, how we as a society learned what math was and how math is practiced in other cultures and societies. I think what she's saying is that how do we get math? Where does it come from? And the second one, your class gave me knowledge about other cultures, numerical systems, and how they used it in their everyday lives. I really liked learning about each culture's lifestyle, history, and the intelligent way of how each culture came up with a system to use numbers. I find that comment really important because I want people to see that the way we do it is not the only way to do it, that every way has its own distinct value. And lastly, I feel enlightened by the way that you taught how counting was different in various parts of the world. I mean, I knew they had to do some sort of math, but not knowing that each culture varied made me wonder how their mathematical abilities varied. I honestly have to say there were many aha moments for me that I still carry with me as I reflect on your class. And I know that these students in their daily lives are seeing the mathematics that they do in their own lives more than they did before they took this class. So that's basically what the course is about, how the course is set up. And there's 3 particular topics I want to spend some time talking about. These are 3 that I've developed. Most of what I use is material that I borrowed from various people. But there's 3 particular things that I've embellished on. And the first of which is the concept how menstruation created mathematics. To begin with, there's a book by a woman named Judy Grahn called Blood, Bread, and Roses, with the subtitle of How Menstruation Created the World. She's the originator of what she calls metaformia, which is the idea of that much of human culture, if we go back to the origins of human culture, developed out of women's menstruation and the issues that come up around it. I took some of that and came up with what other people were talking about and came up with how menstruation created mathematics. To begin with, we look at what's the oldest mathematics. Well, you don't really know, but the oldest thing we have any information about are these old bones. This is one example. The Ashango bone was found in the Congo of Africa. It's about 25,000 to 20,000 BCE, so that puts it roughly 25,000 years ago that this bone was made. It's a bone, there's 4 different shots of it, and on it are notchings. And if you examine it, you don't necessarily see the 28 and 29 notchings unless you get out the microscope and look carefully. This is the oldest one, or not necessarily the oldest one, but the one that's most well known, the first of these that were discovered. But they were discovered throughout the world in various forms. In the Americas, we find it on petroglyphs, rock notches on rocks. In Europe, was found on both on rocks and on various other antlers and various other things. But so these are all set up in groups of 28 or 29 notches. And then the question has been, well, what could that possibly be? Well, what does 28 or 29 correspond to that you would group? And you think about people 20,000 years ago, we didn't live in buildings. We were intimately aware of what was going on in the world around us. So the answer was, well, they've got to be lunar calendars. Well, that idea has been around for a while. What I brought to it was to say, well, but what was the culture? If we're going to think about not just the teaks or the mathema, meaning calendars, but what was the culture? What was going on with the rest of the environment? Well, at the same time, here's 2 images. The Venus of Willendorf, a small stone image painted with red ochre from Willendorf, Austria, from 30,000 to 25,000 BC, so roughly the same time. Another one, a bas-relief image from La Salle, France, from roughly the same time as the Ashango bone. These are 2 from the continent of Europe, but these sort of goddess images, Venus images, are found around the world from roughly the same time. And then we ask, well, what does that have to do with? What does that have to do with it? How does a culture fit there? The question is, at this time, well, what were humans, what were they doing? What was their spirituality? And the answer is their spirituality was about honoring ancestors. And then you say, well, who are your ancestors? Well, if I ask you that, who are your ancestors? The question is, who is your most immediate ancestor? Your parents. Well, the question then is, how does your mother know that you are her child? How did your mother know? You came out of her body. She was able to physically see that. How does your father know? Usually that question gets a little chuckles along the way. Well, today we can do DNA testing and so on. Today we know what role a male plays in conception. 20,000 years ago, humans didn't know. What was magical was that women at a certain age started to bleed once a month. And then when they stopped bleeding, magic happened. A life began in their body. So what's important? Where does life come from? What life comes from women's bodies. Life comes from the magic of menstruation. So in that cultural context, there was a culture where women, their bodies, their sexuality, and their life-giving ability were honored and at the center of the spiritual life of the human communities. So the lunar calendars, would they have been just reflections of the moon, or I say they would have been reflected of the resonance between the phases of the moon and in that culture in particular, the sacred menstrual cycles of women. So they weren't just looking at the moon, they were women counting days as well. So this suggests that women's menstruation had an important influence on the very earliest of mathematics, and probably women were, if not the first, among the first mathematicians. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. I've talked about this particular thing in a number of settings. In particular, I did one, was a feminist spirituality conference that I went to and gave a talk on this. And it was amazing the number of women afterwards who raised their hand and said, if I had only known that when I was in algebra, it would have felt like part of me. And I think that's the important part, that we have to begin with that. So this is back to the idea of counting. This is where counting begins. Counting begins for humans that we know of in keeping track of records of time. Then the second thing I want to talk about is divination and synchronicity. What could mathematics possibly have to do with divination? Well, first of all, I want to think about modeling reality. What's real? What is real? Well, we have different ways of answering the questions. What's happened, what's happening now, and what's gonna happen. What has happened, what is happening, and what will happen. We have different ways of thinking about that, what is reality. One in particular is causality, cause and effect. If I hold the ball and let go, what will happen? Can you predict? Can you tell me? Can you predict the future? It will go down, okay? We know that there is a cause, gravity, that will pull this down. We know that if we study hard and well, what will happen to our grades? They will go up. If we refuse to study and refuse to open up our books, refuse to pay attention, we know that things will go down. We have a notion of cause and effect. This one action or event causes another to happen. Much of science is based upon that. Much of medical research is based upon that. If I give you this drug, how will it affect this? If I give you this, it will cause this. So we base the way we look at the world on cause and effect. In fact, we tend to see that as reality rather than a model of reality. But there's also some philosophers who suggest that all we really know is that one thing happens and then another thing happens. Do we know that this one causes that one? In fact, we can also take a slightly different view, a probabilistic view, which says we can't predict anything that's going to happen any one time. Take a pair of dice and roll them. What's going to happen? Can you tell me that you will get 2 1s? Can you tell me that you will get a 7 as a total? You can't tell me what will happen at any one time, But I can predict, if I do it often enough, I'll get 2 ones, 1 out of 36 times. I can do a little work and I can predict that. Statisticians in the probabilistic view is really important, really does not look at the causality. In fact, one of the most interesting things was a paper published, I believe it was in London, that said that diapers cause babies. Because when the number of diapers on the lines and the clotheslines went up, the number of births went up. Okay, well, we can see that that's not true. We can, from other ways, suggest, cause and effect suggests it's the other way around. Babies cause diapers. But both of those, the cause and effect and the probabilistic view, are models of reality. And to say that's the only way to view what's real, how to answer those 3 questions, is to limit yourself. I think it's more important to say, are those useful? Yes, it is very useful to use a cause and effect model. That's probably what helped to get humans to the moon, that model. And probabilistic view does a lot of good work. That's one of my major fields that I work with. Actually, my training was in probability and statistics. And we do a lot of useful things for that, but there are other useful ways. And in particular, if we look at Carl Jung, a psychologist, Carl Jung, he suggested that there's an acausal connection between the psychological world of the collective unconscious, what I'm going to think of as the divine world. And you can think of this in a multiplicity of different ways, from divine in a God or goddess sense, or source sense or creator sense, to a purely psychological. I believe what Carl Jung was mostly thinking about was there is a collective unconsciousness of all humans, or just a sort of a ethos of the way things are together. There's an acausal connection between the psychological world and of the collective unconscious and the physical world around us. In fact, he suggests that certain events in each of these worlds tend to happen together, even though there is no cause and effect relationship between them. He spent a number of years studying the I Ching, and I'll talk about that in a moment. It's a Chinese form of divination, and he discovered that it worked. It helped people. So it was a useful model of the world to look at this. His idea was that when something was happening in someone's life, when one did something in divination, this same sorts of things always came up when this particular sort of thing was happening in one's life. So there's this acausal connection between the divine world and the physical world. That becomes the basis for divination. Unfortunately, in today's world, divination usually conjures up images of, what was the person on TV recently? I can't remember her name. The woman who had all the 1-800 numbers that you could call up and get your tarot cards read. What was that? Miss Cleo, yes. That's the image that we typically have in today's world of divination, that it's about somebody telling you what's going to happen to you. That's not solving the mathema problems. The mathema that humans have always had to deal with is what do I do with my life? What do I do now? I'm running into a situation. What do I do? I need to know what's happened, what is happening, and what's going to happen. I need to know how to think about that, and I need advice. Where do I get advice? Well, we consult. Humans consult the divine. So divination has been a universal human activity practiced by practically every human culture. How we conceive of the divine varies considerably. For some people, that may be praying. For some people, that may be rolling dice or tossing coins or pulling out tarot cards. For some people, it may be going to the Oracle of Delphi and talking to the women who have been breathing in the fumes and getting them high, and using that to get to the divine. But humans do that all throughout history and through many cultures. So, but why does it work? Or what's a model of why it works? The mathematical model is to say it's applied synchronicity. Meaning, if I take a deck of tarot cards and I have a question and I shuffle them and do whatever I need to do and I lace them out and I get a particular set of cards. Why do I get that particular set of cards? They are, the principle of synchronicity says, this is causally connected to what's going on in my life. Or if I take some coins or yarrow sticks is the way that one creates I Ching, or I take some dice and I roll them, or I do something, the randomly generated result, physical result, is causally connected to what goes on in the other worlds. And whether that's real is not a question so much of what is real, but is it useful? Is it a useful model? And many people, in fact, all of human history, have found that to be very useful. So the principle of synchronicity says that when we generate a divinatory device, while it's randomly generated, it's necessarily going to give us information about the querent's physical and psychological and spiritual life. Term in there I should probably explain. The word querent is used when we talk about divination to meaning the person who has a question. And whether that person is the diviner depends on whether you got your own deck of tarot cards and you do it yourself, or you go to see somebody to do it for you. But the querent is a word that I'll be talking about in a number of things here. And I have four suggestions of forms of divination that I've looked at. I want to look at a little bit about how they're done, and then think about what's the logic in them. So the logic of change is from China. This is over 3,000 years old. It's one of the oldest forms of divination that's actually being used. Up in the left-hand corner, we see the symbol that most of us recognize as a yin-yang symbol. Yin and yang are the opposites of classical Chinese culture. Yin is dark, cold, female, feminine. Yang is light, hot, male, masculine. But the important part in Chinese culture isn't that there is one here and one here. It's a flowing back and forth and a flowing around and around. And that's really what's inherent in this symbol. The light, yang, has within it the dark, yin. And if we saw that in a dynamic way, the yin, the dark would expand and the light would expand within until it would be reversed. And then it would switch around and reverse around. Before this symbol, however, these two lines were used to represent the yin and the yang. And the I Ching, the classic of change, is about generating a set of 6 lines. Randomly generating a set of 6 lines and then looking at that as a divinatory device. In particular, there are 64 figures called hexagrams consisting of 6 randomly generated yin or yang lines. Now we can think about, where's the mathematics here? Let's think a little bit about the binary system, meaning any system of writing down that has each digit is one of 2 things. That's what our computers use, our cell phones use, and everything that we have that's digital uses with an on and off switch, positive and negative electron flow. If we write it in classical Western binary, it's sets of 0s and 1s. If it's Chinese hexagrams, it's yin-yang lines. So each of the lines from the bottom up can be a yin or a yang. 2 choices, 4, 6. Multiply those out and we get 2 to the 6, which is 64. So there's the beginning of that logical structure. Actually, that came first. Then, to organize those 64, they were split into 2 trigrams, 3 lines and 3 lines. Typically, now they're generated by coins, meaning you take 3 coins and you toss them and you look at it and you say, well, a 3, heads counts as 3, tails counts as 2. If you get a 6 and an 8, you got a yin line. If you got 7 and 9, you got a yang line. So you toss the coins and then you figure out the numbers and you write down either it's an open line or a closed line. Then you do it again and you generate them from the bottom up. So we've got some probability involved in that now too, because now we're tossing coins. This is the set of the trigrams. Across the top and down the side are the trigrams that have now developed names. Remember, this is 3,000 years old, so this has been a long time developing. And if you look at any one of these, for example, this one right here, the top three are the earth symbol and the bottom three are the heaven symbol. And if you are an I Ching reader, you've either got to have your handy dandy book beside you or you have memorized every one of the meanings of those 64 lines. So first of all, think about complexity. How complex can you be in answering people's questions? To begin with, 64 different ways to think about it, 64 different answers we can give to anybody's question. But we can get even a little bit more complicated, and the I Ching does. Because remember, the yin and the yang are not about yin and yang. It's about yin moving to yang, moving to yin, flowing, always flowing. So when we develop these, remember 6 and 8 give us yin lines. But some of those are old, some of those are new. Old means, well, if it's flowing, if it's yin, and it's old, meaning it's just about ready to move, to become yang. And if it's an old yang, it's just about ready to move. But if it's a new yin, it's going to stay there. So some of these are transforming lines. So an old yin is about to become a young yang. And using the heads and tails, you can see that the young ones are more stable, have a higher chance of happening than the old ones. And then if you get, the more involved you get in I Ching, you discover that there's people that are upset because they have exactly the same sets of probabilities. And the original method, which is very complicated, takes like a half hour to an hour to create one set of hexagrams of using yarrow sticks and tossing some around. The probabilities weren't quite right. So we can get into a whole discussion of probabilities out of this. So here's an example. And remember, when these are generated, we always think of them from the bottom up. So I randomly generated and got 2 heads and 1 tail, add up, and I get this. And the line is a yin line, and it's new. So it's not about to transform. But here is 9, so it is about to transform. So these are the lines that are generated. This is the primary hexagon, which is wind over water. Remember, if you're the I Ching expert, you've got that memorized, what that means. Or, for me, that means the book on the side to tell me what it does. But then, what happens to these? It's like, here's where you are right now, but what are you moving towards? What are you straining towards? We'll change all of those. Change all the ones that are changing, and you get another set. So now, let's look. We have 64 of these. And then for each one of them, it can be about ready to transform or not. So a whole nother 64. 64 times 64 gives us 4,096 different combinations. So now, can we address human conditions? We can come with practically any question we want. 4,096 different possible answers to those. With the idea that synchronicity says that whatever happens is somehow related to whatever happens in the hexagrams is somehow related to what goes on in your divine. So that's basically the I Ching. A couple of others to look at briefly. The Tibetan system is to use dice. These symbols represent the chant, the mantra of Manjushri. This is the picture of Manjushri, who is the wisdom god of Buddhist culture. And these are done by taking one die, chanting the mantra, rolling a die, and then writing it down, and then rolling it again. So you get a pair of 6 times 6, 36 different pairings. That gets added to 11 different categories of questions. So 36 times 6, 36 times 11 is 396 different possible ways to put this together. So the logic can be more complex with this. Oops, wrong one. Out of Northern Europe comes the runes, which was the alphabet of the Northern Germanic people. There's what the runes look like, and each one of those comes with a divinatory meaning again. Again, you memorize it or look it up. And this is interesting that one of the most common readings used in the runes comes out of the mythology as well. It's a 3-stone reading, meaning you take a bag of runes and you either reach in and grab some, you toss a bunch out and grab 3, somehow get 3, put them in order, but they are related to the 3 sisters or the great Norns, or goddesses of fate, the ones who are imagined as spinning the fates of God, of each of us. If anybody remembers the old show Hercules that Xena grew out of, it was a number of years ago, there were a couple of episodes there where Hercules had to go deal with the fates. But then you lay out these and you get an idea of where did I come from, where did what's going on come from, where am I now, and what's happening, using using the mythology of the Norse as well. Another one where we use directions, I'm going to go past that one, to look at another way in which these runes are used. Remember, applied synchronicity is to say, when I generate this, it will tell me what's going on over here. Well, bind runes are sort of the opposite way. I want something to go on over here. I want to have good luck. So I'm going to create a symbol that's related to good luck. So creating this symbol should somehow affect or make happen the good luck. So here's an example where we take one rune, which means gifts, and another rune which means mouth, and we put those together and we come up with give good luck. Now, the cool thing about this is that it doesn't matter whether I write it this way or I flip it over. So we can end up talking a lot about reflections and symmetry and how that fits into creating. One of the ones which I'm sure most of you have seen, and probably at least half of you use, is this symbol down here. The B and the H, because some of it was done in terms of just putting together symbols to make up basically a logo. A B and an H put together makes this. Herald Bluetooth. Anybody have a Bluetooth device? That was named after the Danish king who united the disparate tribes of Denmark into one kingdom. Just as Bluetooth, the Bluetooth protocol is supposed to unite all of your different things into one communication system. And then the other one I want to talk about, again briefly, is the deck of 78 cards. This one has a very extensive logical system. It's 4 suits, and if you've never heard of it, seen a deck of cards, or a deck of tarot cards, think of a deck of playing cards. You've got 4 suits. You've also got, in a deck of cards, you've got the Joker. The Joker is all that's left of the 22 major arcana cards. So you've got 4 suits, collectively called the minor arcana, 22 cards which represents major themes in human lives, total is 78 cards. Here's an example of, this is how it's structured. Each of these suits have names. In classical approach to the world was thought of as composed of fire, water, earth, and air, the 4 elements. So the ancient periodic chart had only 4 elements in it, at least in Western culture. Other cultures have different approaches to this. And each of those suits represents one of those elements. Within those suits are 14 cards, each 1 through 10. So we've got the cycle of our number system in there. And then we have 4 court cards, or people cards, which represents different elements of human personality. So altogether 78 cards. Now if I want to do a layout, take you just the simple, I mean these are the beginning ones, 3 cards reading. So how many different 3-card readings are there? Well, if we got 78 cards, we do 78 first, times 77 choices, times 76, and I've got it written down over there, and I can't remember, but it's a very large number. And if we do this one, where we have 10, well, if you've ever done anything with NPR, not National Public Radio, but a number of permutations. If you've ever taken a math class or you've had to deal with that, try 78, NPR, 10, and you are beyond the capability of your calculator to display it in whole numbers. You're into the e to the 30th or something like that. So, is this a complex system? It's an extraordinarily complex system. Again, the logical structure of divinatory systems is there. It can be very complex and relies upon that idea of applied synchronicity. Okay, moving on to the last piece that I've included in my course is the ethnomathematics of triathlon. Again, I'm a triathlete. That's my culture. So that's where I bring this in from. I always begin by talking about what are the distances, and then why are the distances. The most interesting one, of course, is the Ironman. Why 2.4 miles? Why 112 miles? I mean, most bikers, cyclists, talk about doing century rides, meaning 100, because that's a big number in base 10. Why 112? And why is a marathon 26.2 miles? We get into a little bit of history. Ironman began with a bunch of jocks sitting around at the, I think it was the Honolulu Marathon, bragging about who's the best jock. Is it the swimmers, the bikers, or the runners? And so one guy, he was the captain in the army, and his name escapes me at the moment, said, well, let's find out. Let's do the Waikiki rough water swim. That was 2.4 miles. Let's do the bike ride around the island. That's 112 miles. And then let's run a marathon. And whoever wins will be called an Ironman. And in the first one, we had 17 people, and like about half of them finished. Now it's a extraordinary industry. And then within this, another interesting part, why is it 26.2 miles of marathon? Well, most people have heard of the story of Philippides. He's the runner who, when the Greeks beat the Persians, ran from the Gulf to the town of Marathon, which is 25 miles long, got there and uttered one word. Does anybody know that word? It translates as victory, but the real word was Nike, which is where our shoes come from. And then he promptly keeled over dead. The other part of the story was he'd probably run around 300 to 500 miles in a few days before that, because that was his job. He was a runner, and so he had to deal with the mileage. So come forward another couple thousand years to the first modern Olympics was in Greece, and it was that same run. Second one was in London, and a course was set up for 25 miles. And after the course was set up, the Queen came and said, wait a minute. It doesn't go past the castle. It has to go past the castle so the royal children can see the race. So what did they do? They added 1 mile, 385 yards, and now it's 26.2. If you are a marathon runner, that's a good thing to remember. When you hit mile 25, you can say, damn the Queen. If it wasn't for the Queen, I'd be done. Well, beyond those numbers, the other thing that's always important, all other numbers that's always important to a triathlete is how far and how long. How far, how long, and what's the ratio? In particular, with the three sports, swimming, biking, and running, how do we conceive of that? If you drive a car, how do you conceive of ratios of time and distance? Well, we have miles per hour. And if you're on a bike, that seems to make most sense. But if you're swimming, that doesn't make sense to you. Or if you're running, it doesn't make sense to you. Because what does it mean to go 5 miles per hour when you're running? That's not as important as how long is it going to take me to get through that first mile of the race or the second mile. What's most immediate to a runner or a swimmer is how long it takes you to go a particular distance rather than how far you go in a particular time, which makes more sense if you're a biker. So we conceive of these distances differently. If you are a swimmer, you think of your rate as in time per either 100 meters or 100 yards. Well, where does the 100 meters come from? And then you have to think about what's the Olympic standard for a swimming pool. It's 50 meters long, so one lap is 100 meters. And then why would you use 100 yards? Well, it depends on whether you swim at the Y or you swim at Bally's. One has a 25-meter pool, and one has a 25-yard pool, and you learn to think twice around is 100, and that's the distance I got to think about. So you learn to think in terms of minutes per 100 meters. And same way with running, you learn to think in minutes per mile, unless you're Canadian, In which case, you think in terms of minutes per kilometers. Again, remember, this is all about how does the culture and the problems in the culture, how does it affect how we use numbers? How do we think about them? And the practical mathematics that comes out of this, and it's a very interesting problem to have students work with, is given the timing results for a triathlete's race at a given distance, whether it be, whatever the distance be. So we'll give swim time T1 for that's triathlon speak, for the time it takes you to get out of this water, get yourself ready, get on your bike, and get past the line. And then the bike time. And then T2, the time it takes you to get off your bike and get ready to run and get out on the run. And then the run time. Given those 5 things, what are the total time? What's the swim pace? What's the bike speed? What's the run pace? I'd usually do this at the end of my course. Remember back at the beginning I talked about counting? One of the things I didn't mention that we talk about is Babylonian system, which is a base 60 system. And at that point we talk about adding base 60. Well, it comes back now and they're trying to deal with time. Students are trying to deal with time. They say, wait a minute, we've done this before. And somebody finally figures out, yeah, we're doing Babylonian mathematics. And they begin to see, well, why is it we do base 60? Why do we have 60 seconds per minute, 60 minutes per hour? And it's from the Babylonians. There's a historical context to it. And to show you how this would work, and to show you as well what I like to weave in a little bit of other culture here. My favorite athlete in the world is Sister Madonna Buder. She's a 79-year-old nun, lives in Spokane, Washington. Is the oldest woman to complete an Ironman race last year. She's the oldest woman to complete Ironman Hawaii, which is the world championship. But it's been, I think, 2 or 3 years since she's been able to do that. But last year, she finished Ironman Canada at 16 hours, 54 minutes, and 30 seconds. It's fun to look at this, too. Now, add up those times. Just add up the 4, the 1, the 9, the 5, and the 3, and you'll see you don't get something that ends in 0. And then we can talk a little bit in class. Well, why? Well, we got some rounding going off so that it's keeping track of the whole time. The clock is keeping track of the whole time. But if you add up the individual ones after you've rounded off, they don't quite fit. So, how do we get her swim pace? There's a picture of her ready to go swimming in some race. And then there's the way you convert the miles to 100 meters, you convert the time to minutes, you do some division, and then what really throws students off at the end is, well, we get 2.41. Well, then they try to say that's 2 minutes and 41 seconds. And then we think, oh, well, why not? So it gives us a chance to talk about, we have to do this little last calculation and get the results. And gives them a chance again to start thinking about, what's the difference between their base 10 numbers and base 60 time? And then there's Sister Madonna on her race last year. Can you imagine doing that at age 79? 112 miles in 7 hours, 44 minutes, and 49 seconds. Convert the time to hours, then divide miles by hours, and you get her speed. She's about the same. She's about the same speed that I do. And she's got about close to 20 years on me. And then there's her run pace, 26.2 miles in 7:14, doing the same sort of conversions and coming up with 16 minutes, 36 seconds. So that's how we end up with a discussion of triathlons, getting the students a chance to see how you can take these numbers, put them into somebody's life and do them and have fun with them. So basically that's what I teach. Those 3 in particular are things that I've included. There's also a lot of other good stuff. Everything that I've talked about is available on my website. And you can find it under, actually I always tell students at the beginning of the course when I walk into any of my courses and I ask them, what's my name and how do you spell my last name? That's all you need to know to begin. Google me and the first hit will be my website. Go to there and my course information is there. So thank you very much.